Correspondent based here in Los Angeles. It's 10 o'clock. This is Sky News at 10. Our top story. The tension between Ukraine's president and the United States as he's accused of unacceptable insults and told to sign a controversial deal. Donald Trump is very frustrated, says his national security advisor, as he refuses to row back on calling Zelensky a dictator.
He calls our president a clown. But honestly, you'd have to search far and wide to find a bigger clown than Trump.
We hear the anger in the town where Russian soldiers killed scores of civilians at America's president and his claims, also tonight. The explosions on 3 Israeli buses in what the authorities say is a suspected militant attack planned from the West Bank. The questions for the army held partly responsible after the suicide of a teenage soldier who was sexually assaulted. Why the name's now Amazon when it comes to James Bond, the company taking creative control of Britain's most famous spy. And we'll take a first look at tomorrow's front pages in our press preview from 10:30 right through to midnight. Good evening. Donald Trump has multifold reasons to be frustrated with Ukraine's leader, one of his top advisors said tonight, as he refused to back away from claims President Zelensky is a dictator and Ukraine was responsible for starting Russia's war. America's national security advisor instead said that unacceptable insults had been heading his boss's way and Ukraine needed to sign a deal, giving America a share in some of its mineral wealth. A potential plan for a reassurance force of peacekeepers, including soldiers from the UK, was called unacceptable by Russia today. We'll have more in a moment on how that might work. But first, from Ukraine, our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, reports.
Mr. President, The day after the US president called him a dictator, Volodymyr Zelensky hosted Donald Trump's envoy to Ukraine. Cameras captured the encounter, but no questions allowed, apparently at the request of the American side. The meeting is taking place right now behind those closed doors. Originally, the president and Keith Kellogg were going to be making a statement, but that got cancelled. We've been told, though, that Volodymyr Zelensky is motivated. He has a fighting spirit, despite all this language from Washington. There is the concern, though, that maybe he's not talking to the man in the heart of the Trump circle, that maybe Keith Kellogg is actually a bit sidelined. The language from Washington is increasingly hostile to Ukraine and friendly towards Russia. A top security official dodged a question on whether Mr. Trump also thinks Vladimir Putin is a dictator, and instead criticised Kyiv for rejecting a US proposal to access its natural resources.
President Trump is obviously very frustrated right now with President Zelensky. The fact that that he hasn't come to the table, that he hasn't been willing to take this opportunity that we have offered. I think he eventually will get to that point, and I hope so very quickly.
With the US no longer a reliable partner, Ukraine needs Europe to step up. Here, NATO soldiers training in Romania. Western officials say British and other European troops could be deployed to Ukraine as part of what's being called a reassurance force following any ceasefire deal with Russia. But the very idea prompted an outcry from the Kremlin.
Of course, the deployment of military contingents from countries that are NATO members on the territory of Ukraine is not acceptable to us.
With the war still raging and so many false claims coming from the White House, we return to one of the towns that Russia first targeted. This memorial in Bucha, a permanent tribute to the victims of a month of Russian terror. This is the reality of Russia's war. Hundreds of people killed, an entire community terrorized. No one here in Bucha believes anyone other than Moscow was to blame for their suffering. Yes, they're rebuilding their lives now, but as one woman asked me, who is going to mend our souls? Olena lived through that hell. She was shocked to hear the US president recently suggest Ukraine had started the war.
He's dishonest. He calls our president a clown. But honestly, you'd have to search far and wide to find a bigger clown than Trump. A circus act. That's what he is.
But no one is laughing here. Deborah Haynes, Sky News, Bucha, Ukraine.
The White House confirmed tonight that Sir Keir Starmer will meet Donald Trump in Washington next Thursday. The president's national security advisor said he welcomed the promise of security guarantees raised by Britain and France, which could include troops being sent to Ukraine as peacekeepers. Our correspondent, Gurpreet Narwan, has this on what officials say that force might look like.
We don't know what peace in Russia and Ukraine would look like, but we do know that the onus would fall on Europe to maintain it. This is Ukraine's front line with Russia. It's 640 miles long. The shaded red, that's territory Russia has taken from Ukraine over the past decade. President Zelensky says 110,000 troops would be needed for any peacekeeping force to be effective. And European military chiefs are prepared to send personnel, but the number in question are far smaller, under 30,000. And crucially, those soldiers would not be posted close to frontline areas in the east of Ukraine out of concern they could be attacked by Russia. Instead, this is being described as a reassurance force to support the return of Ukrainians to the country and to protect critical infrastructure. Troops would be sent to major cities, ports and nuclear power plants, which could prevent attacks like this one on the Chernobyl power plant last week. Satellites, spy planes and drones could also help in the effort. Fast jets would protect Ukrainian airspace and allow commercial flights to resume. And warships could be sent to the Black Sea to remove Russian mines. So there's more to this than the number of boots on the ground. But Zelensky has been clear. He wants more of them too. So how much could European countries send? Well, the British Army has around 75,000 regular full-time soldiers, the French 114,000 and Germany 60,000. Although only a fraction would ever be sent, in the UK, defence sources say we could be looking at just 5,000. And then there's the US, whose army dwarfs ours. So Keir Starmer has said the plan would only work with the US backstop, but the Americans have definitively ruled out sending troops. And whatever the plan, the rules of engagement will be vital.
All peacekeeping operations need the consent of the warring parties, the antagonists, for peacekeepers to be on their territory. One presumes within this operation that the consent of Ukraine would be there, but would we have the consent of the Russian forces?
For its part, Russia has said the presence of European or NATO forces in Ukraine as part of a peace deal would be unacceptable. So this is still very delicate and far from a done deal.
Well, our correspondent David Blevins is in Washington, D.C. for us tonight. And David, a rare night when Donald Trump himself is not making the headlines, but those around him certainly are.
Indeed, Donald Trump is marking the first full month of his presidency with a White House event for Black History Month. But for once, he is allowing those around him to do the talking. We've heard today from Steve Witkoff, who is, of course, better known as the president's Middle East envoy, but is fast becoming his international deal maker, I should say, because he says it was his visit to Moscow to bring home an American hostage that set the scene for a better relationship with Vladimir Putin. We've also heard from the White House National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, that he believes the Ukrainian president needs to, in his words, tone down the rhetoric and come back to the table and negotiate. We've heard from the Vice President, J.D. Vance, who says they stand on the cusp of peace in Europe because Donald Trump is, in his words, an effective negotiator. And interestingly, we've also heard from another Trump ally, Nigel Farage, who is back in the United States. He faced some criticism yesterday for his silence when Donald Trump described President Zelensky as a dictator. But my colleague James Matthews caught up with him in Washington earlier.
Do you think Volodymyr Zelensky is a dictator?
No, of course. I mean, don't be ridiculous. But, you know, you never...
Is that ridiculous? Donald Trump has called him a dictator. Donald Trump has called Zelensky a dictator. Is that ridiculous?
If that's what he thinks, that's what he thinks.
Is that ridiculous?
Take everything Trump says, not literally. Truthfully, but not literally.
Now, amid all this political noise, I think the most substantive words today may have come from President Zelensky himself, who posted online that Ukraine stands ready to agree an effective security and investment agreement with President Trump. That feels like a shift. And of course, all of this will be on the agenda next week when President Macron of France and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer both come to the White House to meet with President Trump. It feels like it's going to be a critical week in his effort to bring peace to that region.
David, thank you. There have been a series of explosions on buses in Israel tonight in what police say appears to be a militant attack. The explosions took place close to Tel Aviv. Police say they were explosive devices on 4 buses. There have been no reports of any injuries. Bomb disposal units were called to defuse unexploded bombs, with police saying the explosives matched those used in the West Bank. Israel's defense minister has instructed the army to intensify operations against refugee camps in the West Bank. Well, the explosions tonight followed a day when Israelis lined the roads in grief as the bodies of 4 hostages were released by Hamas and driven home in convoy. They're believed to include a mother and her 2 children who were taken during the October the 7th attacks. 4 black coffins were displayed on a stage before being put into Red Cross vehicles, a move which was described by the United Nations Human Rights Chief as abhorrent. From Jerusalem, our international correspondent, Diana Magne, reports.
A sombre and hugely painful day for Israel as the bodies of 4 hostages who died in Hamas captivity are brought home. Police special forces saluting the convoy as it passed en route to Tel Aviv for final forensic checks. But Israelis know whose bodies these are. Images of 83-year-old Oded Lifshitz and the Bibas family beamed out over Hostage Square. Ariel and Kfir Bibas and their mother Shiri, Kfir just 8 months old when they were taken, symbols of the horror of October the 7th. Oded Lifshitz, one of the oldest to be taken hostage, a veteran peace activist who had long campaigned for Palestinian rights. Israelis lining the way to pay their respects.
The farewell from the Bibas family and Oded Lifshitz, who just passed by. It's not easy. It's not easy. It's very sad. And it's only the beginning for the sad things that will come.
The UN human rights chief condemned Hamas for this ceremony, calling the parading of bodies abhorrent and cruel. Hamas using the moment to send its own message that these 4 were killed by Israeli airstrikes, a claim impossible to verify. About the 17,000 Palestinian children it says have been killed in this war. But it was Hamas who attacked on October the 7th. And Israel's prime minister is bent on vengeance still.
The voices of our loved ones cry out to us from the earth. They demand that we settle accounts with the vile murderers.
That's as may be. For now, though, this is a moment to remember the innocence of the Bibas boys, the anguish of their mother, and the gentle activism of Oded Lifshitz, who devoted his life to a just peace. Diana Magnay, Sky News, Jerusalem.
The mother of gunner Jaisley Beck has a 2-word answer when asked who she blames for her daughter's death: the army. A coroner today ruled that their failure to properly investigate complaints of sexual assault contributed to Jaisley's suicide. One woman who served with her told us she didn't think any woman was safe in the army. A warning: there are details in Becky Johnson's report that you may find distressing.
Jaisley Beck was lively, confident and good at her job. But as a gunner in the Royal Artillery, she was sexually assaulted and subjected to intolerable harassment. The failure of more senior officers to report her assault to the police was a breach of army policy. The way the complaint was handled contributed to her death by suicide. Her family were in court as an inquest concluded the army had failed to protect her.
The army has admitted that it let Jaisley down and has apologised for its failings. But no apology will ever bring our daughter back.
Instead of facing serious sanctions, the soldier who sexually assaulted Jaisley simply wrote her a letter of apology. He was later promoted. It meant when another soldier more senior than her, Bombardier Ryan Mason, sent her thousands of messages, she didn't report him, despite feeling afraid of being alone with him. Her mother in no doubt who to blame for her daughter's death.
The army. I believe that this was systemic. This has happened to so many other female soldiers. When it comes to sexual assault, sexual harassment and sexual abuse, the army should not be marking their own homework.
This inquest has put the spotlight on a culture of misogyny within the army and prompted hundreds of female soldiers to detail their experiences on social media. Tamsin Hort was friends with Gunner Beck and served in the army at the same time. She says the abuse was constant.
I don't think it is safe for young women, or even not just young women, any woman in the army. It's a man's world. It's a lad's culture. You're a lad if you say things like that, or you do things, or you're inappropriate. You're a lad, that's it. Some people make your life a living hell, and that is the reason why I left.
From the army, an apology and acceptance that Gunner Beck was let down.
The 3 years since Jaisley's sad death have seen significant changes in the army, including the introduction of clear and unequivocal policies to state that there will be zero tolerance to unacceptable sexual behaviours.
The family of Gunner Beck have urged the Prime Minister to ensure immediate change so women can serve in the British Army without fear of harassment and abuse. Becky Johnson, Sky News, Salisbury.
The infamous kiss by the boss of Spain's Football Association, given to one of his unwilling players, was sexual assault, a court found today. Luis Rubiales now faces a fine of more than €10,000. He was acquitted, though, of coercion, and the captain of Spain's women's football team said tonight that had left a feeling of resentment amongst her fellow players. Our sports correspondent Rob Harris reports.
This is the World Cup euphoria that became court evidence. Spain's triumph tarnished by an abuse of power with the world watching live. Starting a fight for justice by star forward Jenny Hermoso. A judge now ruling there was no consent for the kiss forced on her by then Spanish Football Federation President Luis Rubiales. And we aren't showing the moment of the sexual assault in the medal ceremony that Rubiales has now been convicted of. But spared jail, only fined €10,000. And following last week's testimony, acquitted of coercing Hermoso into publicly exonerating him in the days after beating England in Sydney, leaving Hermoso's teammates questioning the judge.
I think the conviction for sexual assault is correct. What I find somewhat striking and seems strange to me is that there is no conviction for coercion. It sums up the feeling of resentment in the dressing room.
Rubiales did everything to distract from the team's heroic homecoming in August 2023, defiantly clinging to power before being banned by FIFA, and denigrating Hermoso. But his hostility galvanised a wider It's Over movement across Spain against sexism and inequalities.
I think it is a step forward and a ruling that makes it clear that our law is a good law. It is a law that protects women and that consent is at the centre of a relationship. When there is consent, there is a consensual relationship. When there is no consent, as a ruling says, there is assault.
It's seen as a landmark conviction in Spain, even the most powerful being prosecuted for acts of sexual aggression. Victims believed, not doubted. Rob Harris, Sky News.
The Pope is said to be improving slightly, according to the Vatican tonight. He spent his 7th day in a Rome hospital, reading and signing documents and holding telephone conversations. The 88-year-old is being treated for double pneumonia after struggling with breathing difficulties for several days. Officials say the full-scale repair at the site of a sinkhole in a Surrey village could take several weeks, if not months. A 20-metre-long section of Godstone High Street has been swallowed up and several homes evacuated. Surrey County Council says it's working as quickly and safely as possible to enable residents to return. Police say the man suspected of shooting dead 43-year-old Lisa Smith at a pub in Knockholt in Kent on Valentine's Day is thought to have died after falling into the River Thames. He's been named as Edvard Smith, whose car was found abandoned near the Dartford crossing. Searches are continuing to find his body. France is bracing itself for one of the biggest child abuse trials in its history, with a surgeon accused of sexually abusing hundreds of children. Joel Leswarnek has been charged with the rape or sexual assault of 299 patients over a 25-year period, in a case that has raised serious questions over child protection in France. A warning that this report from our Europe correspondent, Adam Parsons, contains descriptions of sexual abuse and references to suicide, which you may find distressing.
Adorable.
For Roland and Morissette, grief and anger are entwined with their pursuit of justice. Their grandson, Matisse, was just 10 years old when he was taken to hospital with stomach pains. The family was met by this man, a doctor, Joel Leswarnek, now accused of being the worst child abuser in French history, often assaulting children as they lay under anaesthetic.
He told us that they needed to keep Matisse under observation in hospital overnight, and that if anything urgent happened, we would be alerted.
Leswarnek told the family to leave Matisse in his care and to go home. That night, he allegedly abused the boy as he was in bed. Leswarnek is accused of assaulting and raping 299 people, mostly children, over the course of 25 years. It's claimed he wrote down the details of all these crimes in diaries later found at his house. Many victims were unaware they'd been attacked until told by the police years later.
But when they left having told him, and they shut that door, Mathis was alone again, and I think it was at that moment that his world came crashing in around him, and he had flashbacks.
The trauma was too much for Matisse. Addled with addictions, he took his own life in 2021, aged 24. Joe Lesquanic had worked at more than a dozen hospitals, mostly in Brittany. The average age of his alleged victims was just 11. He was finally caught in 2017 when the 6-year-old daughter of his neighbours said he'd sexually assaulted her while she was in the back garden. This is the house where Joe Lesquanic lived in Jonzac. When police went inside, what they discovered were child-sized dolls, some of them chained up, hundreds of thousands of indecent images, and also diaries and notebooks where he'd recorded his own acts of abuse. This woman was one of them. She was just 10 when she was allegedly raped by the surgeon. Marie, which isn't her real name, was treated by Lesquanic in a hospital in Vannes for acute appendicitis.
When I heard that I was among the alleged victims, I told myself, that's the missing jigsaw piece to my life. I try to find words without anger. I think this man is a predator. He's a predator of children. He destroyed my life and destroyed the lives of so many children. And this man's place is in prison, and he needs to stay there. He's dangerous. He cannot be allowed to touch or be near any children.
Lesquanic is already in prison, convicted in 2020 of raping 4 young girls, including 2 of his own nieces. But he could have been stopped much sooner. Nearly 20 years ago, a tip-off from the FBI led to him being convicted of sharing and downloading child pornography, but he only got a suspended sentence. Lesquanic will face justice here in Vannes. His trial is expected to last 4 months, and he will answer for the deeds of his past. The people allegedly abused by a surgeon when they were small children, now returning as adults to confront him in court. Adam Parsons, Sky News, Vannes in Brittany.
At the end of the last Bond movie, Daniel Craig's 007 appeared to have come to a sticky end, leaving questions over how he'd be replaced. Tonight, it's clear that decision won't be made by the producers who've guided the Bond franchise through virtually its entire existence. The Broccoli family are stepping back, and Amazon's MGM Studios are taking over creative ownership of Bond. Our arts and entertainment correspondent, Katie Spencer, looks at what that might mean.
From Roger Moore to Timothy Dalton, Pierce Brosnan through to Daniel Craig. As long-time producers and custodians of James Bond, up until now, Michael Wilson and Barbara Broccoli have not only had the final say over who plays the spy, but also the stories we've seen on screen. But now, in a dramatic plot twist, comes a surprise announcement that the pair are stepping back, handing over creative control to Amazon.
Having problems keeping it up, Q?
In 2022, when Amazon acquired the studio's MGM, that included its Bond back catalogue. The streaming service saying it's honoured to usher in the next phase.
Amazon had creative control. They know people love Bond, and they want to give people Bond things, not just in the film sense, but in every sense, with spin-offs galore and whatnot, which could be catastrophic. I hope they don't go down that route.
Barbara Broccoli, who's always been fiercely protective over her father's franchise, explaining, "My life has been dedicated to maintaining and building upon the extraordinary legacy that was handed to Michael and me by our father, producer Cubby Broccoli. With the conclusion of No Time to Die and Michael retiring from the films, I feel it is time to focus on my other projects." At Pinewood Studios, home to the 007 soundstage, this should open the door to production finally getting underway on a long-awaited new film. Of course, it won't be Daniel Craig throwing himself around inside of here, since he walked away from the lucrative franchise after No Time to Die. But it's highly likely that all this behind-the-scenes wrangling is why a new Bond, whoever that may be, has yet to be named. Of course, Amazon taking charge of the reins could also potentially mean spin-off TV shows for the streaming service. something which Broccoli wouldn't be drawn on when I spoke to her about the Amazon deal in 2021.
Does that mean that we might see a sort of spin-off TV show? Or?
We have not wanted to do spin-offs, so I think that's our position. They certainly have told us that that the films will be theatrical films in the future, and we'll see what happens.
Amazon has already had a Bond reality show. Now with 007 under new management, could the new reality be more of this to come? All this uncertainty, enough to leave any fan a little shaken and a little stirred. Katie Spencer, Sky News.
Well, that was Sky News at 10. Coming up, we'll take a first look at tomorrow's newspapers in the press preview. Tonight, we're joined by Conservative Home's Deputy Editor, Henry Hill, and The Guardian's Deputy Political Editor, Jessica Elgott. Amongst the stories we'll be discussing, this on the front of the Financial Times. Its headline, Washington opposes phrase Russian aggression in G7 Ukraine statement. Do stay with us, we'll be right back.
Mandatory evacuation, you must leave!
For many people, Harvey is far from over.
People here believe the water will be this deep for weeks.
I'm Greg Milam, and I'm Sky's Chief North of England correspondent.
Are you trying to run me over, Sir Philip?
No, go away.
Look like it, sir. Will you respond to those who made accusations, Sir Philip?
Can you go away?
Sky News, the full story first.
Welcome back. You are watching Sky News. In just a moment, the press preview. A first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. But first, our top stories. One of Donald Trump's senior advisors says the US president has multifold reasons to be frustrated with Ukraine's leader, whom he's called a dictator, and said Ukraine needed to sign a deal giving America a share in some of its mineral wealth. A coroner has ruled that the Army's failure to properly investigate complaints of sexual abuse contributed to the suicide of Royal Artillery gunner Jaisley Beck. There have been a series of explosions on buses in Israel tonight in what police say appears to be a militant attack. No injuries have been reported. You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages of the newspapers as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with Conservative Home's Deputy Editor, Henry Hill, and The Guardian's Deputy Political Editor, Jessica Elgott. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. The Financial Times leads with the ongoing tensions between Ukraine and the United States, with Washington objecting to its G7 allies describing Russia as the aggressor in the war with Ukraine. A warning from the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, that the West should not be fooled by Putin's attempts to dress up imperialism as pragmatism. That's on the front of The Guardian. The Eye hears there's pressure on the Prime Minister to raise the UK's defence spending to 3% of GDP. The Metro has the story of 19-year-old soldier Jaisley Beck. A coroner ruled today that she took her own life following repeated sexual harassment by a senior colleague. The Express quotes Jaisley's mother speaking about the army. No apology will ever bring our daughter back. An image of Daniel Craig as James Bond is on the Times front page. But the paper leads with the Prime Minister's plan to offer European countries an Australian-style youth mobility scheme. The Mail focuses on figures from the worlds of music, media and film, backing its campaign to protect Britain's creative industries from the threat of AI. The Telegraph has seen evidence suggesting that records of misconduct by doctors can be inadvertently erased if they change gender. An image of the former BBC presenter Hugh Edwards dominates the front of The Sun with the headline, "Cough Up Hugh." The Mirror says an extra 700,000 people will get emergency dental appointments after a campaign by the paper for dentists for all. And The Star looks ahead to a decidedly mixed weather forecast tomorrow. Sunshine in the south, but snow in the north. And we're joined tonight by Henry Hill and Jessica Elgott. Welcome to both of you. Let's start with Ukraine and the FT front page there. The headline, Washington opposes phrase Russian aggression in G7 Ukraine statement. Henry, there's lots more behind this story, but take us into what the FT is saying.
Yeah, essentially, hoping my voice holds up. Essentially what's happened is throughout this conflict, the G7 has been clear, for very obvious reasons, that this is a Russian-initiated war, right? Russia has invaded Ukraine. The clue is that it's being fought on Ukrainian territory and that Russian forces currently occupy about 20% of Ukraine's sovereign territory. Yet, after Donald Trump's extraordinary intervention this week, where he seemed to suggest that actually he doesn't view it that way, the Americans are now trying to prevent the latest G7 statement referring to Russian aggression. Instead, they're trying to pivot towards terminology calling it the Ukraine conflict, which obviously mysteriously sort of makes it sound as if it's something that's just happened. It doesn't identify the other party at all. Now, this seems to be Donald Trump's strategy of buttering up the Russians, presumably in the hope that he can secure a deal that will allow for the withdrawal of American support and a freezing of the conflict at bare minimum. But it's nonetheless extraordinary language, given that America has shifted so much and it's offered so much to the Kremlin, and in exchange, so far, the Russians haven't offered anything back. There's been no goodwill out of Russia. There's been no gesture from Putin. So he's banking all of these concessions And now America is still trying to undermine the work of other allies to signal very clearly that Ukraine is the victim, Russia is the aggressor.
And Jessica, this comes in the context of Donald Trump saying that Zelensky is a dictator and that Ukraine started the war.
Yeah, and just to put what some of Henry was saying into context, this statement has been issued every year around February 24th, which is the anniversary of the conflict. Last year, Russian aggression was mentioned 5 times in that statement. So to withdraw it completely just shows you how much the sands have shifted and how much the effect of Donald Trump in the White House has meant for support for Ukraine. I mean, broadly speaking, the rest of the G7 nations are not backing down on this. It sounds like the FT's got 5 sources from 5 different nations who were saying that this is something that they find to be totally unacceptable. But for now, you can just, you're seeing the way that he described Zelensky as a dictator yesterday, the push, the demands for £500 billion worth of mineral wealth, resources from Ukraine, which is supposedly payback for, I think it's roughly about $60 billion worth of support from the US for the war. If you're President Zelensky, things are starting to look very desperate.
Especially when we know that they traditionally publish a support of Ukraine on February the 24th every year. This is completely thrown up in the air.
Exactly, and obviously Ukraine's war effort is, for all the heroism of its people, dependent on American, Western, but particularly American support, material, money, and so there must be a real fear now in Kyiv about what happens if, and previously this would have been unthinkable, what happens if the Americans just pull the rug completely? Because we've seen, for all the high rhetoric that's come out of Europe denouncing, and we're going to get onto that, I think, denouncing Donald Trump, that Europe is not an alternative to an American support, right? We've given Ukraine most of the equipment that we currently have. Other European countries, Germany and Poland, have said they are not going to send even peacekeeping troops to Ukraine. So the best case scenario, and there's always a danger of trying to sort of decode Donald Trump because you risk maybe making a more reasonable case than he is actually making. But if you think about it, if he's determined to drive through any deal just so he can be the person who secured peace, Russia would potentially be okay with freezing the conflict on current borders, which would mean it's kept control of Crimea and the Donbass. Ukraine has said that it will not accept peace on those terms, right? It will not accept peace that involves ceding its sovereign territory. So therefore, from Trump's perspective, he maybe sees Zelensky as a sticking point, and he's trying to bring as much pressure to bear as possible. But either way, it is absolutely extraordinary given the sacrifices Ukrainians have made and all the support that the America and other Western countries have given them. Because if this was going to end up being the position, I mean, America, we could have just pulled the rug out from under them years ago, and at least hundreds of thousands of people would still be alive, right? It's an extraordinary betrayal.
And I think that the one card that you hold if you're President Zelensky, and it's a very high stakes one, is that if Trump does want to be seen as this deal maker, if he does want to be the one who brought peace to the region and kind of get all the kudos of that, which is the kind of thing that he likes to be, then you need the Ukrainians to accept a deal. So you can't. So if you can then potentially pull the rug and say, let the Russians march into Kyiv. But at the moment, it looks like Trump actually wants to do a deal to stop the war. So therefore, he needs him to find something to agree to.
All the efforts are being put into stopping the war internationally. And we know that Sir Keir Starmer and President Macron are travelling to Washington next week. The Telegraph, looking at the line that Macron will actually challenge Trump over his weakness towards Russia. That's what's being reported.
Yeah, and this really highlights how difficult a position Keir Starmer is in, because Donald Trump is a very thin-skinned man. Part of the reason that he's going so hard on President Zelensky is that he just doesn't like the way that President Zelensky has been talking to him, or what the things that he said about him. And so, on the one hand, there is a potential there with that meeting next week for Britain to act in its traditional capacity as a sort of bridge between Europe and America. But on the other hand, how do you do that whilst still conveying to Donald Trump the message that you think his position on Russia is profoundly wrong and self-defeating? Macron's position will play very well in Europe. It's morally correct. but it's not going to get him any meetings in Washington, and it's probably not going to change any views in the White House. So it's a question of whether or not Keir Starmer, with the more diplomatic approach that London has taken so far, can get results.
Yeah, and I think Number 10's position, even before all of this happened, was that the only way to win round Donald Trump was flattery. And that's the strategy that they've constantly pursued.
Well, they're certainly not
all the way through it.
criticising
no,
at all.
There was a hint in that call with Zelensky that Keir Starmer had yesterday. He said to him in the sort of second paragraph of it that he did not think he was a dictator, and reminded him that Britain didn't hold elections during the Second World War, or at least the vast majority of it. So that was the reason that that he, that's a kind of maybe an underhand statement of support that criticises something Donald Trump's saying. But, that's as far as Keir Starmer's prepared to go publicly, at least so far. And that he seems to believe that, you can win more flies with honey.
It is going to be a tall order for Sir Keir Starmer, though, isn't it? Because one of the things he will want to say to Donald Trump is that this insistence there needs to be a US backstop if there are British peacekeeping forces within Ukraine. Donald Trump has said categorically there will be no American boots on the ground, so he has to convince him of that.
Yeah, this is another challenge for Sir Keir Starmer, because, of course, just a few weeks ago it was reported that military chiefs were telling him even the British couldn't do it alone, even a peacekeeping mission. We simply do not have enough deployable troops to peacekeep that entire border. Now, there were two alternatives, therefore. There was a sort of Anglo-American force, potentially with others, or there was a European force. Unfortunately, currently, both of those are off the table. Trump has said he won't put troops on the ground, as you say, and on the other hand, Germany, it was a bit meaningless, but Poland, which actually has a large deployable military, has also said that it won't put troops on the ground, and therefore Britain... Exactly. So Britain's in the sort of slightly odd position of being the only one willing to send troops that it doesn't have, whilst the various countries that have troops aren't willing to send them, which, from Ukraine's perspective, must be sort of bleakly comic. But yeah, absolutely, he needs to build one coalition or the other, because otherwise it looks like grandstanding. And I think one of the challenges that any British Prime Minister would have in Washington is Trump can say, well, you've been free-riding off us, right? Like, why don't you have enough troops to do this? Why don't you have enough troops even to go and stand there once I've negotiated this peace? That's going to be very difficult.
Even if we give you a backstop, which is one of the things...
Yeah, but there are also divisions within European leaders, because Olaf Scholz is saying that he found it irritating that Sir Keir Starmer was even raising the prospect of providing peacekeeping troops, and this wasn't the time to be discussing that.
I think it would be very unlikely to see Germany make that commitment, perhaps at all, but particularly not immediately before some elections. I think the point that you could argue with that is that if we are by making this commitment this early before there's even anything on the table, it's like, how do we know that this is the deal that we're prepared to agree to, or prepared to defend? It felt, I think, to quite a few European capitals that it was premature to kind of come in behind the US and in behind this deal to make peace before we knew any of those terms.
Well, the British government definitely haven't been critical of President Trump, but in The Guardian, David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, critical of President Putin. The West should not be fooled by Vladimir Putin's attempts to dress up imperialism as pragmatism in advance of any talks on the future of Ukraine. Yeah, and again, you can see the Foreign Secretary there threading the needle of trying to distance London from Washington's new position on the Russo-Ukrainian war without directly riling President Trump ahead of the Prime Minister's meeting. And it also highlights just how difficult any settlement is going to be, because, of course, I mentioned that Ukraine's position is that they want a peace that respects their status quo ante borders. But the Russian position is also very tricky, because at the start of the war, you could just about envision a settlement where maybe they withdrew to the borders before 2021, right? They went back to the People's Republic of Donetsk and Luhansk, or whatever it was in the east, and they kept Crimea. De facto, no one recognised it. But the problem now is that I think last year, or maybe in 2023, President Putin annexed all the territory currently occupied in eastern Ukraine. He made it formally part of the Russian Federation. Now, that makes it vastly more difficult, probably impossible, for his regime to now cede that territory back, which means that the only deal I expect the Russians will accept is a frozen conflict along the current border. And the question is that going to be acceptable to the Ukrainians? Jessica, just because we're running out of time, can we quickly look at the Times and Elon Musk slamming Zelensky?
Yeah, and Elon Musk and Zelensky have clashed in the past, dating way back, way beyond, before he was so closely associated with Trump. And he called him, in language that typically goes even further than Donald Trump, says it calls him a massive graft machine feeding off the dead bodies of Ukrainian soldiers. And, that's the kind of thing, when President Zelensky has lost so many of his countrymen in battle, to kind of say that he's deliberately prolonging this war, deliberately putting lives at risk. It comes off the back of this joint press conference that was supposed to be between Zelensky and Donald Trump's envoy that was cancelled in Washington today. So it's really been quite a bleak 24 hours, and the war of words that's flying across the Atlantic is really something to behold.
Indeed. Henry and Jessica, thank you very much for the moment. We can take a break. Coming up, coroner rules that failings by the army in responding to sexual harassment and assault contributed to a young soldier taking her own life. We'll discuss that next.
Sunday, the Premier League is exclusively on Peacock. The league's most dynamic scorers square off. Goal for Haaland! Erling Haaland and Man City. It's a fantastic goal! Mo Salah and Liverpool. Time after time, he is Liverpool's shining light. This is the Premier League. That's just stunning! Sunday, only on Peacock.
I'm David Blevins, and I'm Sky's senior Ireland correspondent.
It takes 60 minutes to cross the Irish Sea. It took the British monarchy a century.
I've spent 30 years reporting the journey from conflict to peace.
The political parties of Northern Ireland have reached agreement.
If there's anyone who might know how to fix Northern Ireland's devolved government, it's the American architect.
Changes in circumstance require changes in approach.
The end of the political stalemate, the start of a new chapter for Northern Ireland.
I confirm that I am willing to take up the office of First Minister. My election to the post of First Minister demonstrates the change that's happening on this island.
Catholics and Protestants on different sides, now facing the same threat.
If we both contract COVID-19 and end up in hospital, religion's nothing.
People here are adept at finding hope amid adversity. That's the spirit of a place that punches way above its weight. We help you understand the world with us. A toxic blue-green algae now poisoning Loch Ness. It's breaking your heart what has happened here.
It is.
This is a vital resource, a national treasure, now fighting for its very life. They are effectively surrounded by Northern Ireland, and that makes this the most unlikely of international frontiers.
If there's a hard border, I think it'll cripple the country.
Winter is coming. Welcome to Winterfell. It's an iconic location in this globally acclaimed drama. Ophelia was the most powerful hurricane this far east in the Atlantic on record. Sky News, the full story first.
Weeknights on Sky News.
This is your chance. Tell people. Welcome to the Politics Hub.
Our police force has apologised. If you want to find out about Grimsby, you come to the docks.
I'm live in Jerusalem. Are you not concerned that that could lead to all-out war?
Hello there, good evening. There are fears of an upsurge in violence. What's at stake here?
You are watching the press preview, a first look at the front pages as they arrive.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story.
I'm ready. Are you?
Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Welcome back. You are watching the press preview, still with me, Henry Hill and Jessica Elgott. Let us take a look at the Metro and this terribly sad story, the findings the coroner into the death of 19-year-old Jaisley Beck. Hounded to her death is the headline. She took her own life after various incidents, bosses bombarding her with 4,600 texts, sexual assault also. Jessica.
I mean, this is one of those stories that you hope will really herald a kind of a culture change or a deep internal soul searching for the culture in the military, particularly for young women. She's just 19 years old, and when you hear the kind of extent of the evidence that was presented at the inquest about how the volume of stuff that she was subjected to, and of course, then you got the headline that on the Daily Express and that her mum said, which is that no apology will ever bring our daughter back. But I hope, I'm sure we all hope that it goes well beyond an apology. What happens next when it comes to the interrogation of how things should change?
Well, one of the contributors to the report that we did on this, one of her previous colleagues in the army, was saying that the army is simply not safe. It's not a safe space for women.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, given, as you say, the volume of evidence that there was available to the inquest. She did complain, right? This isn't one of those things where nobody knew anything about it until the tragedy happened and then it all spilled out in the open. She complained. She did the right thing. She complained to her superiors. That should then have been taken care of. And I think, obviously, the best that you can ever hope comes out of anything like this is that it is at least a catalyst for reform so that the same thing doesn't happen again. And what I really want to hear from the army is how on earth was this conduct not considered? How was it not actioned? Right? The official thing is, the complaint she made was that a senior officer pinned her down and put his hands between her legs. In what universe, in any workplace, anywhere, is that not something that gets, an immediate temporary suspension, a full investigation? Right? I just want to know how the officer who received that report, what he was thinking, what the process was that led to nothing happening, because it's extraordinary. It actually boggles the mind that anyone in a modern professional workplace of any description could have overlooked that.
And so her family say, whatever, there's no apology that can bring their daughter back. Just finally we're going to the Mirror, and this story about dentists, the promise that everyone who needs one will now have access to a dentist. Good news, Jessica.
Yeah, I mean, certainly good news. And in certain parts of the country, this has been an extraordinarily difficult problem. You think getting a dentist appointment should be one of those very easy, routine things. And you hear particularly people in rural areas having to kind of, if they can't go to a private dentist, then they're having to wait for months, years to even get on the list of a dentist, never mind get an appointment. And, people living in extreme pain or even, God forbid, taking matters into their own hands when it comes to trying to dislodge their own teeth.
Pulling their own teeth. Yes, we've heard terrible stories of that. But, Henry, just got about 30 seconds. 700,000 people will be seen now.
It's better than nothing. Obviously, an announcement is not the same as rollout, and we'll have to see. But the problem with NHS dentistry is chronic, it is vast, and it arises from the simple problem, which is that we can't, the NHS budget is what it is. Wes Streeting does not have the money to fix it permanently. He's not been given it. And in any system, you have to ration through queues or price. And in Britain, we ration through queues.
Henry and Jessica, thank you. We'll see you in the top of the 11 in a minute. Let's take a look at the weather for you now. Well, the next few days will be mild with spells of wind and rain, but Saturday doesn't look too bad. Tomorrow, expect a cloudy, mild and wet start for most, with strong winds bringing gusts up to 70 miles per hour in the west. There'll be outbreaks of rain through the morning, locally heavy, but central and eastern England look mainly dry, with sunny spells. It'll be very mild again, but windy, with coastal gales for areas surrounding the Irish Sea. The afternoon will see rain easing eastwards to become confined to northern Scotland and southeast England later on. That'll leave sunshine and just a few showers elsewhere. The strong wind will ease going into the evening. Saturday looks mainly dry. Coming up next on Sky News at 11, Donald Trump keeps up his war of words against Ukraine's President Zelensky. His advisors say he wants some of the country's mineral wealth.
I saw police being forceful, pushing young men and women to the ground as they made almost 100 arrests. Will the cold affect your voters?
Well, we have a lot of tremendous support.
Free
wherever you get your news.
The people here know that worse storms may well be on their way.
I'm Martha Kellner and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
Mandatory evacuation, you must leave!
For many people, Harvey is far from over.
People here believe the water will be this deep for weeks.
I'm Greg Milam and I'm Sky's chief North of England correspondent.
Are you trying to run me over, Sir Philip?
No, go away.
Look like it, sir. Will you respond to those who've made accusations, Sir Philip?
Can you go away?
Sky News, the full story first.